Welcome to the learning perspective in psychology, and we're starting the learning perspective, which is also known as the behaviorist perspective in psychology, with the Bandura et al. Study. And the Bandura et al. Study was done in 1961, and it's one of our major core studies. And basically, it talks about how we as humans, how we learned from our environment. So let's take a look. Okay, so if you weren't in class or if I didn't have a chance to show you, I did show you some, um, basically some quick short videos that gave you like pros and cons about video game violence. Do playing video games cause a person to become aggressive and maybe model the violence? And there are people that believe that, yeah, it might actually contribute to violent behavior, especially in young children. And then there's people who say that it does not contribute to actual violent behavior. And you guys, as students, have different opinions on this. So in the CBS morning video, they interviewed a few child psychologists, and they were very much, saying that that's bad, showing your kids even violent television, exposing them to that, and also allowing them to play violent video games. They mentioned Grand Theft Auto would be, again, a very bad choice because they're going to model that bad behavior. In this particular video, they don't say the opposite, but they don't necessarily say that there's any research to indicate that violent video games actually cause violence. Okay, so in that last one, I know we didn't see the whole thing, but they're basically saying that the meta-analysis, which means that they've taken experimentation like from a wide array of people, have not really indicated with any certainty that video games actually cause the violent behavior. There might be a correlation to it, and might people, have you ever played a video game and you got really upset or frustrated and then you started to get a little aggressive maybe with your language, maybe you yelled at the screen or you threw your controller or you got really upset because you were frustrated when you were playing the game. But they even make a comparison between kids that are very skilled at a video game having less propensity for that kind of aggressive behavior. So again, there's different like views as to, the whole video game controversy. Does it cause violence necessarily? And there really isn't any solid research that says that it does. So there's a lot of videos out there that talk about like this whole controversial topic. Do violent video games make children or prime children to be violent? One of the things it does talk about is moral disengagement. Do these violent video games, like for example Grand Theft Auto, does it disengage you from your morality? Does it actually make things funny that we might actually see in real life as something, really horrible? I often use the example of South Park. South Park is, they really have a moral disengagement. Like the theme of the show, some of the themes are just like really awful, and there's a lack of morality, and then we perceive it as funny. And then there's some things that happen all the time, and I'm just using South Park as one example. Kenny. Kenny dies like all the time. It happens, nearly every episode, not every episode, and he comes right back the next episode, and you're like, what happened to Kenny? Although, that question's been answered. Um, South Park is an example of just gratuitous violence and total moral disengagement that we might find humorous as a culture. Is that contributing to bad morals? Is that contributing to maybe priming us for aggressive kinds of thoughts and maybe actions that spill over as a result of those thoughts? Just saying, just saying. I know that a lot of you might disagree. Now, the background of Bandura's study is threefold. What causes aggression? And theorists point to three possibilities, and you're writing this down in your notes. Biologically, could you be pre-programmed to be aggressive? Might have that aggressive tendency be passed down from generation to generation. Number two, situational factors. If you're put in a strange situation or maybe a situation in where you have to defend yourself, would you perform a violent act? And think about defending your own life or defending the life of maybe someone that you love. What would you do? And being a mama bear myself, I would do just about anything to protect my kids. And I'm sure a lot of moms and dads out there feel the same way, right? That situational factor. Would it make you do something aggressive or violent? So that's theory number two. Theory number three is saying that could aggression be learned? Could you be modeling it from the TV shows that you watch or the video games that you play? And that's what Bandura, the real primary focus of his study is that. It's called social learning theory and modeling. Okay, so the background and the premise for the study is that Bandura believed that conditioning all by itself is probably an inadequate explanation of the majority of social behavior. And to test this idea, he set out to design a study to provide support for his concepts. And that's the core study that we're learning. And so this leads us to a word called conditioning. And when I say the word conditioning, a lot of kids, well, it's actually funny because some people think of hair conditioner. But when I say the word conditioning, a lot of you might think of like when you're training, like an athlete is conditioning their body to prepare, for, um, you know, whatever their sport is. Like you're getting ready, you're training, you're conditioning yourself. Well, conditioning, another way of thinking of conditioning is learning. Whenever you get stuck and you think of you're having trouble kind of wrapping your mind around something, I want you to replace the word conditioning with a word like training or learning. And if you do that, suddenly it makes sense. There's three different types of conditioning. The first one's called classical. You're writing this down in your notes. Classical conditioning, when a reflex is paired with a neutral stimulus, like with phobias. We're born fearless. We learned phobias. So if, for example, we should not be fearful of my Sharpie. Sharpies are good and useful things, but what might make you fearful of the Sharpie? What if the Sharpie caused you pain? What if the Sharpie, right, you got poked in the eye with the Sharpie? If you pair Sharpie with pain, you might have a phobia of Sharpies, right? And you might generalize it to all Sharpies of all colors. Depends. That's classical conditioning. Classical conditioning involves always a neutral stimulus and involves a reflex. Think of cotton balls. Cotton balls are good and useful things. Why are there so many people out there that are scared of cotton balls? Yeah, cotton ball phobia. Google it. It's a thing. Why? Think about what happens right before you get a shot. Cotton ball, right? Clean the area. Shot. Cotton ball, shot. You pair that a couple of times and you might look at cotton balls and feel a little weary or even scared. Phobias, classical conditioning. The second kind of conditioning is called operant conditioning, and this is from learning from the consequences of your actions. So you do something first and then you get repercussions afterwards, consequences. They could be good consequences, they could be bad consequences. And that's what operant conditioning is all about. It's learning from the consequences of your actions. And the third one is called modeling. This is pure imitation. This is just copying, right? You see something and you do it. If you act like your best friend, you guys could finish each other's sentences. If you have the same gestures and mannerisms, that is copying, that is modeling, that is pure imitation. And that's the third aspect of conditioning. In class, we saw one of the worst cases, one of the worst and most unethical experiments ever performed in psychology was the famous Little Albert experiment where John B. Watson successfully trained a well-adjusted 11-month-old baby to be fearful of all white fluffy things, namely rats. Every time he would reach out to touch a white rat, a loud sound was hit behind his head and it would make him very fearful of the rat. But here's something interesting. Not only was the baby scared of rats, but he was scared of everything white and fluffy. In fact, he was known as the baby that was scared of Santa Claus because of the white fluffy beard. And again, what did he pair? Every time the baby would go out and touch the white rat, right? A loud sound would be paired with it. And babies are naturally scared of loud sounds. We're scared of loud sounds. So if a big loud bomb goes off, we definitely are going to feel nervous. It's pretty normal. It's kind of like an unconditioned stimulus, a natural stimulus that we are scared of loud sounds. They're bothersome and they're startling. Well, imagine pairing that every time the baby touches the white rat. Now, interestingly enough, he generalized his fear. Now remember, before they did this experiment, they showed the baby a variety of things. They showed him dogs and a monkey and a rabbit and rats, a fur coat, burning newspapers, and guess what? He was afraid of nothing. That baby was fearless. Like most babies, they're fearless. They know nothing until they encounter life and they get some kind of experience with it. Then boom, they learned what works, what doesn't work. They learn what hurts, what doesn't hurt. And again, things that hurt or things that scare them, they'll stay away. Okay, so in operant conditioning, there's a bunch of examples, and here's one from Big Bang Theory. Okay, so the rest of the show, they proceed to show how Sheldon gives her positive reinforcement through chocolate for behavior that he perceives as good behavior. And that's operant conditioning. You're learning from the consequences of your actions. Okay, so also, there's a couple of the elevator experiment. You can Google that. There's a YouTube video like right down there. The elevator experiment shows how people just copy each other. And it's kind of funny because everyone faces the same way in the elevator. If everyone was facing a different direction, would you face that direction too? And that's the experiment in the elevator. Again, it's how the environment affects your own behavior and even your thoughts. And in this part of the notes, you're writing down personal information. Give me an example of classical conditioning in your life, right? Like a phobia. Have you ever paired a reflex with a neutral stimulus, like being scared of cotton balls or being scared of a pen, right? Or do you have like an association with something that might not be natural? That's classical conditioning. Then give me an example of an operant conditioning example, like how your parents have reinforced you, right? Given you rewards or given you consequences for bad behavior. And then the last example you're writing in your notes is social learning theory. Is there someone that you imitate or model? Like, do you talk just like somebody, like you and your best friend? Like, are you guys like mirror images of each other? If that's true, guess what? That's modeling. Write that down in that little spot. And we're learning about the social learning theory according to Bandura. And he says that learning occurs through the interaction with other people and through watching, through observing, through imitation. And we also call that modeling. And modeling isn't just like on the runway. Modeling is I do what you do just because you're around me. Have you ever like watched a whole like marathon of Harry Potter and the next thing you're, talking like a British person and you're like, hey, baby, little ball caps, Harry Potter, right? And you're talking like a Brit. Could be because you've watched like 7 hours of a marathon of Harry Potter. And the next thing you're doing is like you're emulating, you're modeling, you're imitating the accent because you've been listening to it for 7 hours. And it just kind of rubs off on you, right? Right. And then you're writing down in your notes the different aspects of social learning theory here. And it originates from behaviorism. And it suggests that the environment, which we also called nurture from the nature nurture controversy, rather than nature or genetics, is responsible for your behavior like aggression. And they're going to focus on aggression in the Bandura study. And then number two, they're talking about behaviors positively reinforced are going to be increased. You're likely to imitate things that reinforce you. Number three, for example, a child imitates their older sister, having a tantrum and punching a school friend because they see her being rewarded by getting attention. And maybe she gets her way. And so the child watches how the sister can get away with it, then they'll do it too. And it even happens with pets. When you're socializing your pets, it's very often that trainers and coaches will say if they're around other pets who are not trained and who are not behaving properly, guess what's going to happen to your pet? They're going to model and imitate those behaviors too. So that's a bad thing. Number four, there's four cognitive mediating factors that determine if the aggressive behavior will be imitated or not. It's attention, retention, reproduction, and then motivation. And last but not least, aggressive behavior that is seen to be rewarding either directly or vicariously is reinforced and more likely to be repeated or imitated. Okay, so you are kind of filling in the social learning theory here. Attention suggests that a person cannot learn by observation unless they're aware of the important aspects of a model's performance. So you're writing that in the attention square. Retention is that you have to be able to not just see it, but then remember the behavior or skill that they observed. And that's the role that retention plays. It's like your memory, right? You have to be able to see it and then remember it. Then reproduction, you have to be able to reproduce that particular action that you're observing to see if it results in the same kind of reinforcement that the model receives. So not only are you watching, you're remembering, but you have to be able to do it as well. That's reproduction. And then adopt means that the learners are more likely to adopt a modeled behavior if it results in a positive outcome. So if it works out for you, you might do it again. It might increase the frequency of the behavior because you got rewarded for it. The aim of Bandura's study is to demonstrate that learning can occur through mere observation, just watching, of a model, that imitation can occur in the absence of a model. And then in this particular video, you will see the Bobo doll experiment. Now, there are different hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 says that children shown aggressive models will show significantly more imitative aggressive behavior than those shown non-aggressive or no models at all. Hypothesis 2 says that children shown non-aggressive or subdued models will show significantly less aggressive behavior than those shown aggressive or no models at all. Hypothesis 3 says children will imitate the behavior of a same-sex model to a greater degree than the opposite sex model. So if it's a female child watches a female adult beat the Bobo doll, they're more likely to do it too because a fellow female also beat the Bobo doll. Now, hypothesis 4 says boys will show significantly more imitative aggression than girls, especially with a male model rather than a female aggressive model. And the sample was from Stanford University. They had 72 total people, and 36 boys, 36 girls, and they were from the university nursery school. The age ranged from 37 to 69 months, and that translates to 3 to almost 6 years of age. So we're talking a 3-year-old, which is like pre-K, to a 6-year-old, which is like first grade. The experimentation, there were 3 groups, each with 24 children in them, 12 male and 12 female. The first group, the experimental group, was observed with an aggressive model. The second group was observed with a non-aggressive model. And then the control group did not have exposure to any model. They just had exposure to toys. The groups were subdivided, totaling 8 experimental and 2 control groups. And it was considered an independent measure design because they're comparing these groups to each other. And here's a breakdown, like a chart form, of what I just said. Now here are the different variables. The independent variable, there's 4. There's the presence of a model. Then there's the behavior of the model. Was the model aggressive, hitting the Bobo doll, or was the model non-aggressive, not hitting the Bobo doll? The third IV, the third independent variable, was the gender of the model. Was it a female model or was it a male model? And then the last one was the gender of the child. Was it a female child watching a female model? Or was it a male child watching a male model, or vice versa? And the dependent variable is what we're trying to find out here, right? That's the dependent variable. And we're trying to find out the amount of aggression displayed by the child in a later situation. And this is a breakdown of the sample for you. Okay, so since we learned about classic and operant and social learning theory, I want you to kind of practice the different kinds of examples that you could come up with classical, operant, and social learning theory or modeling. These are different case scenarios. And this is the Albert Bandura social learning theory, the Bobo doll experiment. Okay, so to control for extraneous variables within the study, the researcher and teacher rated the children on a 5-point scale. Because remember, we have to operationally define what is aggressive behavior. We actually talked about this way back when in the research, when we studied research terms. And this is important because of inter-rater reliability. We want to be able to say, okay, this behavior is aggressive, this behavior is not aggressive, and we're going to rate it on a scale. For both experimental groups, the phase one setup, each child individually were taken to an experimental room at the nursery, and the model, also known as the stooge, was invited to join in the game. The child seated at one corner with stickers and potato prints, things like that, those little potato stamps. And the model was seated at the opposite corner with Tinker toys, a mallet, which is kind of like a little gavel, and a Bobo doll. Bobo doll is like an inflatable clown that when you hit it, it bounces back up. And you might have had one growing up as a child. I know my kids had like Spider-Man, and it was destroyed like within days. So it didn't last long because it's inflatable so it could pop, and then there's like sand or water on the bottom of it, so that's why it comes right back up. So the phase one experimentation was a non-aggressive condition where the model assembles and plays with Tinker toys but does not punch the Bobo doll. Now, the phase one modeling condition, the aggressive condition, the model started playing with the Tinker toys for a little bit, but then got the Bobo doll, the inflatable clown, and started beating the Bobo doll. It would lay the Bobo on his side, sitting on it, punching it really hard, hitting it with the mallet, throwing it in the air, even kicking the Bobo doll around. And then also the aggressive model would say remarks like, "Pow, hit him down. He sure is a tough fella." A sign of the times, right? It was the early 60s. And the models were supposed to be identical in their actions, so they would follow a script so that the level of aggression was the same for all who were watching. Here's some footage and some pictures of kids emulating the aggressive model, and you can see that they're hitting the Bobo doll. These top ones here are the adult model, and the bottom ones are the children modeling. The phase two aggressive model, all children, including the control, were taken to the next room and subjected to a mild aggression arousal. Basically, children were allowed to play with very attractive toys like a fire engine, a jet plane, a spinning top, a doll set for about 2 minutes, and then they were told by the experimenter that that those were her best toys and she needed to save them for other boys and girls to play with, so they were taken away from them. And that was supposed to get them to get a little frustrated and maybe, get a little anger going to see if they would actually like play out that aggressive model. And you have to ask yourself, why did they decide to potentially upset the kid? For the aggressive group, the other studies show that watching others acting aggressive often inhibits your aggressiveness. For the non-aggressive group, they didn't experience, anything so that they wanted to be aggressive. So they wanted to kind of incite them to get frustrated that maybe would kind of spill over into aggression. And remember, for the control group, none of those things were done. For the procedure for phase three, the test for delayed imitation, each child was escorted to a room with a one-way mirror. The child was recorded for 20 minutes by two observers on the other side of the mirror, and they were recording the child's actions every 5 seconds. They had about 240 observations for each child. A neutral experimenter sat on one side of the room while the child played with available toys. What toys did they have? Aggressive toys like a mallet, a dart gun, a tetherball, and a 3-foot Bobo inflatable clown. The non-aggressive toys were a tea set, crayons, dolls, cars, and animals. All observers didn't know which condition the child was in except whether the child had a female or male model. So they weren't sure if the child had seen the aggression. They were just watching, and then they had a rating system. Was this child behaving aggressively or not based on a 1 through 5 scale? They did not know, remember, that the experimenter, the people that were judging the child's behavior, did not know if they were watching the aggressive model or the non-aggressive model. And so here is the procedure kind of like in a chart form. Room one, a place for the child to get comfortable and settle in, a place where the aggression was sometimes modeled by the adult. Room 2 had the attractive toys that the children were told they couldn't play with. That's to kind of light that fire of frustration. And then room 3, a place where the dependent variable was measured. And in phase 3, the test for the delayed imitation, number 1, the imitation behavior of the aggressive model. Were they physically aggressive? Were they verbally aggressive? Or were they not aggressive at all? They also engaged in that non-aggression speech. They had partial imitation behavior, like using the mallet on other toys, maybe hitting other toys, not just the Bobo doll. Then they had number 3, was the non-imitative physical and verbal aggression, just punching or using other toys to beat up the Bobo doll. And then the 4th category was non-aggressive behavior, non-aggressive play with the available toys. They're sitting quietly, they're playing with Tinker toys, they're not engaging in any type of aggression whatsoever. And this is just kind of showing us the aggressive toys versus the non-aggressive toys. And you can see they would consider the aggressive toys being like the dart gun and like the Bobo doll. Yeah, that's the potato. It's like a stamp, and they use it to, you could like take a potato and it's really old. You guys are just like, why can't you just get regular stamps? The different rooms and the different toys located in each room. And then the experiment. All right, what were the results? The children from the aggressive model group showed significantly more imitation of the model's physical and verbal aggression and non-aggressive verbal responses, which fulfills the first hypothesis. Children from the aggressive model showed more partial imitation and non-imitation physical verbal aggression, also fulfilled from hypothesis 1. Children from the non-aggressive model group showed little aggression. In the non-aggressive group, the male model had a significant inhibiting effect on children. Boys displayed significantly more imitative physical and verbal aggression. Girls displayed more verbal imitative aggression and non-aggressive imitative aggressive behavior with the female model. And the conclusion also provided support for Bandura's social learning theory, that learning through social behavior and modeling is something that happens. We watch, it's like monkey see, monkey do. We watch and we do. We listen and we repeat. It shows identification of which models are likely to be imitated. The study shows that children can learn as a result of imitation without being reinforced or punished. This suggests that models, like modeling, is a form of observational learning, that just by watching TV, whether you're reinforced or not, you might model a behavior that you see. The study also shows that people will produce new behaviors that they have observed, and they can generalize these behaviors to new situations. Um, so just because they hit the Bobo doll doesn't mean they wouldn't hit like another doll that was available in the room. They used the mallet on the Bobo doll, but they could also use the mallet to smack a baby doll, or the little horsey that was displayed. They could hit that with the mallet, so they could kind of generalize the bad behavior. Female aggression seemed to cause confusion amongst children as it went against social norms. So they would say things like, that's not a way a lady behaves. It was unusual and weird to see the librarian woman dressed nicely hit and beat down a Bobo doll as opposed to watching a man do it. So that was confusing. The conclusions also showed that aggressive male models were more likely to be imitated, as it was seen as normal in society for men to be a little bit more aggressive with, say, the dolls. And how is this useful? Well, it goes right back to what we've been talking about, video game violence and the things that we see on TV. Does it affect your way of thinking? Does it affect your moral code? And will it increase your aggressiveness, which might spill over into actual violence? Now, some people might argue with Bandura and say, you know what? Playing Call of Duty for 7 hours or a violent video game might act as a catharsis, kind of like an emotional release for you, where you shoot him up on Call of Duty and then it doesn't compel you to be aggressive in real life. That's the big question. If a psychoanalyst, someone of the psychoanalytical perspective who believes that subconsciously these things are a way of releasing pent up emotional anger, maybe. Now, the strength of the study, number one, it's a lab setting. So that's going to have strong standardizations. So that's going to increase the strength of the study. The lab allowed for replication of the study. There was quantitative data collected, and there was also qualitative data, though limited. There was also qualitative data collected as well. These are all strengths to Bandura's study. The weakness of the study was that it had low ecological validity, low mundane realism. It wasn't something that kids considered to be normal, like this librarian, well-dressed professional woman beating down this Bobo doll. It was just strange. It wasn't something that you see in everyday life. Um, so there was no real true standardization of the models. Like later on, when it was replicated, they used a video, right? But it wasn't like real life. And sample from one middle class US nursery school doesn't make a sample across the board. This was a very small area. The sample was relatively small. Is it a microcosm of society in general? That's to be questioned. And it was criticized as categorizing children's actions as aggressive, but children may have seen their behavior as playful, not so much as aggressive. Have you ever seen boys play? Being a mom of boys, like there was always something being broken in the house or somebody jumping off of the couch and jumping onto somebody and wrestling and, that kind of stuff. And it was play, it wasn't really fighting. So could that be just playful and not being aggressive as they're categorizing it as? And there's a couple of ethical issues, and that, negative ethics will lead to the weakness of the study. Ecological validity. Think about this. Children were in a room with a stranger with this weird inflatable doll. Might they act, not themselves? That's a possibility. It lacked adults and peers are different. Like kids will probably model more of a peer than they would an adult, especially when they're so young. And you can't really generalize the results from beating up a doll to other situations. If you beat up a Bobo doll that's meant to be beaten, those inflatable dolls you're supposed to hit it. That's why they bounce back. It's part of like what the toy is about. Does that mean you're going to go out and hit somebody on the playground? They're thinking that that might not actually kind of spill over. And bizarre acts were shown. So, it was just weird in general. So kids might not necessarily bond with those kinds of images because they thought they were weird to begin with. And the ethics, whenever you're involving children and aggression, you're going to have negative ethics here. Parental consent was acquired for the most part, but did the parents know exactly what was happening beforehand? Probably not. Now, debriefing wasn't mentioned. Possible long-term effects of kids watching an adult beat a Bobo doll down. Pretty sure it's not going to traumatize them, but again, that would be negative ethics. Children were asked to witness aggressive behavior. They were expected to exhibit it. They were mildly provoked by taking away toys they wanted to play with, and they wanted to get them frustrated. And then, of course, they were secretly observed behind a two-way mirror. And some children might have experienced some distress, so that would be all under the negative ethics. So now you're going to fill in the grave. Fill in the grave. Isn't that funny? How generalizable is this? So generalizability, you're going to fill this in. Can the findings be applied to the general population? Think about the sample. So it's not really great. Reliability, can it be replicated? Definitely yes. Application, does this have practicality? Absolutely. We watch aggression all the time on TV, play it in video games. This is where the application really lies. Validity, did it test what was intended to test? The answer for the most part is yes, but it was kind of iffy on the ecological or mundane realism. And then the ethics, again, was kind of negative because you're exposing a child to aggression and you're expecting them to act out aggression. So it's not really all positive here. They had some negative ethics definitely to deal with.